The late afternoon sun streamed through the window of David's office as Rachel walked in, carrying a surprise lunch for her fiancé. Her long brown hair was neatly tied back, and she wore the pearl necklace David had given her for their engagement. The sound of laughter from behind the door made her pause, her hand hovering over the doorknob. When she opened the door, her world shattered. There was David, her fiancé of 8 months, with Sarah, her cousin, locked in an embrace that left no room for doubt. "David!" Her voice came out barely above a whisper, the paper bag containing his favourite sandwich slipping from her trembling fingers. David didn't even move away. He just sighed, like Rachel was a minor inconvenience. "You should have called first." "Called first?" Rachel's voice sounded strange to her own ears. "To make an appointment to catch my fiancé cheating with my cousin." "How could you?" Rachel's voice cracked. "Both of you." Sarah rolled her eyes. "Oh, please, don't be so dramatic. It's not like it was serious between you two anyway." "Not serious?" Rachel looked at the engagement ring on her finger. "We're getting married in 2 months." David sighed, running his hand through his hair. Look, this was bound to come out eventually. Bound to come out. Rachel felt tears burning her eyes. "What does that mean?" "Come on, Rachel. You're smart enough to figure it out." David's voice was cold, almost bored. "This thing between us, it was never real. My family wanted the merger with your father's company. That's all." Rachel's hands started shaking. "That's all?" "We've been together for 2 years. We're supposed to get married in 3 months." "Business is business." David shrugged. "Your father's company is failing anyway. There's no point in keeping up this charade." Rachel looked down at her engagement ring. The ring she'd once thought was so beautiful. Now it felt like it was burning her finger. She pulled it off and threw it at David. "You're right about one thing," she said, her voice stronger now, despite the tears rolling down her cheeks. "There's no point in keeping up this charade." As she turned to leave, David called after her. "Don't act so surprised, Rachel. Someone like you should have known better. What did you think? That someone like me would actually fall for you?" Rachel stopped at the doorway, her back straight. "No, David. Someone like me deserves better than someone like you." As Rachel walked toward the door, David called out, "Your mother will be devastated. The wedding plans, the society announcements." Rachel paused at the door. "Better devastated than married to someone who never loved me." "Love?" David scoffed. "Grow up, Rachel. Marriage isn't about love. It's about connections, about status." "Then I feel sorry for you both," Rachel said softly and walked out. She made it to the elevator before the tears came. As the doors closed, she heard Sarah's giggle again, floating down the hallway. They'd probably go right back to what they were doing, not caring about the heart they'd just broken. That evening, Rachel sat at her parents' dining room table, staring at her untouched plate while her mother paced back and forth. "How could you be so stupid?" Her mother's voice cut through the air. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Rachel's father slammed his hand on the table, making the silverware rattle. 2 years of work. Gone! It's just like that. "Work?" Rachel looked up, her eyes red from crying. "Is that all my engagement meant to you? Work?" "Don't you dare take that tone with us," her mother snapped. "The Matthews family could have saved our business. Now what are we supposed to do?" The doorbell rang. Rachel's Aunt Susan walked in without waiting for an answer, followed by several other relatives. News travelled fast in their small social circle. "Oh, Rachel," Aunt Susan's voice dripped with fake sympathy. "I just heard. Poor dear. Left at the altar." "We weren't at the altar," Rachel corrected quietly. "I broke it off." Her cousin Jennifer snorted. "That's not what Sarah's telling everyone. She says David finally saw sense and chose her instead." Rachel felt her face burn. The room suddenly felt too small, too hot. "I saw them together," she tried to explain. "He was cheating." "Well, can you blame him?" her mother cut in. "Look at how you dress, How you act. Sarah at least knows how to keep a man interested. Rachel looked down at her simple blue dress. Was it really so wrong? Was she wrong? Her phone buzzed. Another message. She didn't need to look. They'd been coming all day. Old school friends, business associates, even her hairdresser had heard the news. Did you hear about Rachel? Poor thing. Couldn't even keep David interested. Always knew she wasn't good enough for him. Her father's voice brought her back to the present. You're going to fix this. Call David. Apologize. Tell him you overreacted. Rachel stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. Apologize? For what? For catching him cheating? For making a scene, her mother shouted. For embarrassing us all. I embarrassed you. Rachel's voice shook. He cheated on me with my cousin, and I embarrassed you. At least Sarah knows what's important, Aunt Susan chimed in. Family status, connections. Rachel couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to be closing in. Every face in the room looked at her with judgment, disappointment, or worse. Pity. She grabbed her purse and headed for the door. Where do you think you're going? Her father demanded. Anywhere but here, Rachel whispered, then louder. Somewhere where people care more about what's right than what looks right. If you walk out that door, her mother warned, don't expect us to help you when this all falls apart. Rachel paused at the doorway, tears streaming down her face. You haven't been helping me anyway. You've been using me. She walked out into the cool evening air, her steps quickening as she heard her mother's voice calling after her. For the first time in days, she could breathe. The shame and humiliation still burned, but something else was growing stronger. Anger. Anger at David, at Sarah, at her family, but mostly at herself for trying so hard to please people who never had her best interests at heart. She walked without direction, letting her feet carry her wherever they wanted to go. She ended up at the park, where she often shared her lunch with Edward, the homeless man who always had a kind word for her. Right now, his simple kindness seemed worth more than all the wealth and status her family chased after. Rachel found Edward in his usual spot, near the park bench, reading a worn paperback book. Even in his shabby clothes, there was something dignified about him. The way he sat straight, how his eyes moved carefully across each page. Edward! Her voice was barely a whisper. He looked up, his kind eyes immediately showing concern. Rachel? You've been crying. She sat beside him, not caring that her dress was touching the dirty bench. My whole life is falling apart, she said, then told him everything, about David, Sarah, her family's reaction. Edward listened quietly, offering her his clean handkerchief when her tears started falling again. You know what's funny? She said, wiping her eyes. You're the only person who's actually listened to me, really listened. Sometimes that's all someone needs, he said softly. Rachel looked at him, really looked at him. Beyond his worn clothes and unshaven face, she saw something she'd never seen in David or her family, genuine kindness. Marry me, she blurted out. Edward's eyes widened. What? Marry me, not for love. We barely know each other, but because we both deserve a chance to show the world that dignity and kindness matter more than status. Rachel, Edward's voice was gentle, you're upset. You're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking clearly for the first time in my life, she insisted. You've shown me more kindness in our brief conversations than David did in 2 years. People will talk. Let them talk. They're already talking. Rachel stood up, holding out her hand. What do you say? Want to help me make a point? Edward studied her face for a long moment. Are you sure about this? No, she admitted. But I'm sure about one thing. I'd rather be with someone kind and poor than someone rich and cruel. The courthouse wedding was quick and simple. Rachel wore her blue dress, Edward wore his cleanest shirt. The only witnesses were a couple of courthouse employees who looked at them strangely. When Rachel called her parents to tell them, her mother's scream could probably be heard across town. Have you lost your mind? Her mother shrieked. A homeless man? You married a homeless man? His name is Edward, Rachel said calmly, and he's my husband now. You're no daughter of mine. Her father's cold voice came through the phone. Don't ever contact us again. The news spread like wildfire. David and Sarah made sure everyone knew, turning her marriage into a joke at every social gathering. Did you hear? Sarah's voice carried across the country club dining room. Rachel married a homeless man. Can you imagine? David's laugh was cruel. Well, I guess when you can't keep a real man, you have to scrape the bottom of the barrel. After they were married, Rachel and Edward settled into a single-room apartment with a small kitchenette. It was cramped, but Rachel transformed the space into a cozy home. She hung bright, cheerful curtains and filled the windowsill with potted plants. Each morning, the sun poured in, lighting up their snug little haven with a warm, welcoming glow. One morning, as they were making coffee, their peaceful moment was interrupted by loud knocking. Rachel, I know you're in there. David's voice boomed through the door. Rachel froze. Edward squeezed her hand. You don't have to answer. But Rachel straightened her shoulders. Yes, I do. I'm done hiding. She opened the door to find David, dressed in an expensive suit, looking disgusted at their humble surroundings. So this is what you've come to, he sneered, pushing past her into the apartment. Living in this dump. This dump is our home, Rachel said firmly. What do you want, David? David's eyes fixed on Edward. I want to know what your game is. Nobody just marries a homeless man for no reason. Edward stood quietly, his calm presence a stark contrast to David's agitation. There must be something, David continued. I've had people look into your past. Nothing. No records, no history. You're a ghost. What are you hiding? I'm hiding nothing, Edward replied simply. I'm just living my life with my wife. Your wife? David laughed harshly. You mean your meal ticket? That's what this is about, isn't it? Rachel's trust fund? Rachel stepped between them. I don't have access to that trust fund anymore, David. My parents cut me off, remember? Then why? David's face reddened. Why would he marry you? Because she showed kindness when no one else did, Edward answered. Because she sees people for who they are, not what they own. David turned to Rachel, his voice dropping to a whisper. He's playing you, Rachel. No one is this perfect. He's after something. The only person who played me was you, David, Rachel replied. Now please leave. This isn't over, David warned, backing toward the door. I'll figure out what he's hiding. Nobody is this simple. After David left, Rachel sank onto their worn couch, emotionally drained. Edward sat beside her, his steady presence anchoring her as always. I'm sorry, she said finally. I never thought he'd show up here. You have nothing to apologize for, Edward replied, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. But his visit makes me wonder if we should attend your grandmother's birthday party next week. Rachel tensed at the mention of the upcoming family gathering. She'd been avoiding thinking about it, even as the RSVP card sat unopened on their kitchen counter. Grandma's the only one who supported us, she said after a long pause. She deserves to have us there. The week passed too quickly, and before Rachel knew it, she found herself standing outside her parents' house, her heart pounding. It was her grandmother's 80th birthday, and after weeks of guilt-tripping phone calls from relatives, she'd agreed to come. Edward squeezed her hand. We don't have to do this, he said softly. Yes, we do. Grandma's the only one who still talks to me. Rachel took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. The party was in full swing when they entered. The chatter died immediately, replaced by whispers and pointed stares. Rachel's mother's face tightened at the sight of them. Oh, look who decided to grace us with their presence, Aunt Susan's voice carried across the room. And she brought her charity case. Edward kept his head high, though Rachel felt his hand tense in hers. Her grandmother's face lit up. "Rachel, sweetheart," she hugged them both. "And this must be Edward. Come, sit by me." Before they could move, Rachel's mother intercepted them. "Rachel, dear, the help uses the back entrance." She looked pointedly at Edward's worn but clean clothes. "He's my husband, Mum, not the help." Rachel's voice shook. "For now," her father appeared, drink in hand, "though we have a solution for that little mistake." Rachel's cousin Jennifer snickered from nearby. "Sarah says David might take you back if you get an annulment. Isn't that generous of him?" "I don't want David back," Rachel said firmly. "Be reasonable," her mother hissed. "Look at him." She gestured to Edward. "He doesn't belong here. He's embarrassing us all." Edward stood quietly, his dignity making their cruelty seem even more petty. Rachel felt tears in her eyes. Edward wrapped an arm around her waist, supporting her. "We should go," he whispered. As they turned to leave, Rachel's father called out, "If you walk out that door with him, don't expect anything from us." No money, no inheritance, nothing. Rachel turned back one last time. "Keep it. I have everything I need." In the car, Rachel finally broke down. Edward held her while she cried. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "The way they treated you." "Hey," he lifted her chin. "Their behavior reflects on them, not us." As they drove home to their tiny apartment, Rachel realized she felt lighter, freer. She'd lost her family's approval, but she'd kept her self-respect, and somehow that felt like winning. The next few days passed in a blur of normalcy. Rachel going to work at the bookstore, Edward picking up odd jobs around the neighborhood. They settled back into their routine, trying to put the disaster of the birthday party behind them. But Rachel's family wasn't done with them yet. It was a crisp Tuesday morning when Edward found himself summoned to the Mensa home. Rachel had already left for work, unaware of the early morning phone call he'd received from her father. Edward hadn't told her. He didn't want her to worry. Now he stood at the doorway, the weight of their scrutiny pressing down on him. Rachel's father gestured for him to sit. The atmosphere was tense, unspoken tensions hanging in the air. "Edward," he started, choosing his words carefully, "we want what's best for Rachel, and for her future, which doesn't include you." Edward met his gaze steadily, feeling Rachel's absence like a hole in his chest. "Rachel's future should be her choice, don't you think?" Ignoring his words, Rachel's father continued. "Let's be direct," Mr. Mensa said, placing a thick envelope on the table. "This is $100,000. Take it and disappear from Rachel's life." Edward stared at the envelope, his jaw tight. The insult of being thought so cheap made his stomach turn. "We just want what's best for our daughter," Mrs. Mensa added softly. "What's best for Rachel is letting her make her own choices," Edward replied, standing without touching the money. "I won't be bought." He left them there with their envelope, knowing they'd never understand that Rachel's love was worth more than any amount they could offer. Their attempt to purchase his absence had only strengthened his determination to prove them wrong about everything, about him, about Rachel, about what real love looked like. Edward never told Rachel about the meeting with her parents. She had enough to deal with, and he wouldn't add to her burden. Instead, he focused on their life together, on building something meaningful despite everyone's doubts. And then, 3 weeks later, an unexpected opportunity arrived. One morning a letter arrived at their tiny apartment, its gold embossing catching the sunlight. Rachel picked up the thick cream envelope, her eyes widening as she read the contents. "Edward," she called out, "we've been invited to the Hamilton Corporation's annual gala." Edward looked up from his newspaper, a slight smile playing on his lips. "Would you like to go?" "But how did we get an invitation? This is the biggest event of the year." "Perhaps someone wants to give everyone a chance," he said mysteriously. Rachel studied his face, trying to decipher his cryptic smile, but Edward had already returned to his newspaper. She looked back at the invitation, running her fingers over the embossed lettering. The Hamilton Corporation was one of the most prestigious companies in the city. She'd heard about their galas from her society friends, back when she still had them. Across town, in her parents' mansion, Rachel's mother waved her own invitation triumphantly. David says this year will be spectacular. The new CEO is finally making his first public appearance. The next few weeks passed in a flurry of preparation. Rachel found herself both excited and anxious about returning to the world she'd left behind, but this time she'd be entering it on her own terms, with Edward by her side. The night of the gala arrived faster than she expected. The grand ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers and flowing champagne. Rachel wore a simple but elegant blue dress she'd saved for months to buy. Edward, surprisingly, wore a perfectly tailored black suit that made her raise an eyebrow. "Where did you get that suit?" "I have my resources," he winked. They hadn't been there 5 minutes when they heard the familiar mocking laughter. "Oh my God!" Sarah's voice carried across the room. "Who let the charity cases in?" David strutted over, champagne in hand. "This is a private event. How did you two get in?" Rachel held up their invitation with trembling hands. "We were invited." "Clearly a mistake," David sneered. "Security." 2 security guards approached, but upon seeing Edward, they simply nodded respectfully and walked away. David's face reddened. "What's going on here? I'm a senior manager, and I demand—" "You demand?" Edward's voice was quiet but carried authority. As they made their way to the front, David spat. "These front seats are for executives only. Move to the back, where you belong." Rachel felt Edward squeeze her hand as people gathered to watch the confrontation. Her parents appeared, looking mortified. "Rachel," her mother hissed, "stop embarrassing us and leave." Just then, the lights dimmed, and a spotlight hit the stage. The company's elderly chairman stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to introduce our new CEO, who has spent the last year learning our business from the ground up, literally. Some of you may know him as Edward, the homeless man." The room fell silent. Rachel felt her knees weaken as Edward stood up, straightened his tie, and walked to the stage. "Thank you, Uncle James," Edward said into the microphone. "Yes, I am Edward Hamilton, son of the late Richard Hamilton and your new CEO." Gasps echoed through the ballroom. David's champagne glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the marble floor. Sarah's mouth hung open in horror. "For the past year," Edward continued, "I've lived on the streets of our city. I wanted to understand the people we serve, the community we're part of. But something unexpected happened." His eyes found Rachel's. "I met someone who showed me true kindness, not because of who I was, but despite not knowing who I was. Someone who proved that real worth isn't measured in dollars." Rachel stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. All those months, all those conversations, had they all been a lie? Edward stepped down from the stage and walked to her. "Rachel, I'm sorry I didn't tell you. I couldn't risk anyone finding out, but then I fell in love with you, and every day it became harder to keep the truth from you." "All this time," she whispered. "The only thing I ever lied about was my last name," he said softly. "Everything else, every conversation, every moment, every feeling, was real. You loved me when I had nothing. How could I not love you back?" Rachel's mother rushed forward. "Darling, we always knew you had potential." "Save it," Rachel cut her off, then turned back to Edward. I need time to think." Edward nodded solemnly. "I understand. Take all the time you need. Just know that whether I'm a homeless man or a CEO, my heart belongs to you." As Rachel walked away, the ballroom erupted in chaos behind her. David, his career and reputation crumbling before his eyes, made increasingly desperate attempts to salvage the situation. "Mr. Hamilton, please," he called out, chasing after Edward. "I didn't know. I would never have. Let me explain." Explain what? Edward asked calmly. How you treated someone you thought was beneath you? Or should we discuss your creative accounting in the Morgan project? The colour drained from David's face. Behind him, board members began whispering furiously. That's a lie, David stammered, but his trembling hands betrayed him. The audit team has been reviewing your creative accounting for months, Edward continued calmly. Did you really think nobody would notice? Sarah, seeing her chance at social climbing, through David evaporating, quickly distanced herself. David, how could you? She shrieked, playing to the audience. I never knew about any of this. Rachel's mother, who moments ago had been fawning over Edward, stood frozen in mortification as her social circle watched the scene unfold. The same people who had sneered at Rachel's homeless husband were now witnessing David's spectacular fall from grace. Security, Edward called. Please escort David out. We'll discuss his position with the company on Monday. As David was led away, stammering excuses, Sarah tried to slink toward the exit, only to bump into Rachel's mother, who was herself attempting to backtrack on months of condescension. The mighty had fallen, and everyone in the room knew it. But Edward barely noticed their downfall. His eyes remained fixed on the doorway where Rachel had disappeared moments ago. The victory felt hollow without her. While others had crumbled under the weight of exposed lies, Edward worried he might have lost something far more precious than revenge, the woman who had loved him when he had nothing. The day after the gala, Rachel's mother showed up at Lisa's apartment where Rachel was staying. Her designer handbag clutched tightly. She looked smaller somehow, less imposing. Rachel, sweetie, she began, her voice honey-sweet. We've all been such fools. Rachel stood in the doorway, arms crossed. Really? Just yesterday you were telling me I was an embarrassment. But we didn't know. If you had just told us Edward was... That's exactly the point, Mom. I didn't know either. I loved him when he had nothing. Her father arrived that afternoon, his usual commanding presence diminished. Princess, let's put this unfortunate situation behind us. I've already called the country club to reinstate your membership. Dad, stop. Just stop. Meanwhile, across town, David sat in his office, staring at his termination notice. The words unethical behavior and immediate effect burned into his vision. Sarah burst into his office, her face flushed with anger. Is it true? You're fired. Sarah, please, we can figure this out. Figure what out? She snapped, pulling off the expensive bracelet he'd given her. I'm not staying with a jobless has-been. Edward Hamilton just became the most eligible bachelor in the city. But you said you loved me. Sarah's laugh was cold. I loved your position, David. Now you have nothing. David watched her storm out, the same way he'd watched Rachel walk away months ago. Only this time, he understood the pain of being valued only for what you could offer. For 3 weeks, Rachel stayed at her friend Lisa's apartment, trying to sort through her feelings. In Lisa's guest room, Rachel sat surrounded by memories, photos, movie ticket stubs, the first daisy Edward had ever given her. I don't know what's real anymore, she confided in Lisa. Was every moment a test? But was he studying me like some kind of experiment? One morning, Rachel found David sitting on the building's front steps, not in his CEO suit, but in the same worn jacket he'd worn when they first met. What are you doing here? She asked, her heart skipping. Being myself, he said simply. The self you fell in love with. He stood up, brushing off his pants. Remember that morning when you shared your sandwich with me? You cut it in half and sat next to me on the curb. Rachel nodded, the memory clear as day. That was the moment I started falling for you, he continued. Not because you gave me food, but because you gave me dignity. You looked me in the eyes. You asked about my day. No one had done that in months. But you weren't really homeless, she whispered. No, but my heart was truly touched. Every laugh we shared, every conversation we had, every moment between us was real, Rachel. I may have hidden my wealth, but I never once hid my heart." He pulled out a wrinkled paper bag, the same kind she used to bring him breakfast in. Inside was a sandwich, cut in half. "Have breakfast with me?" he asked. Just Edward and Rachel, sitting on a curb, sharing a sandwich. Sitting there, eating a simple sandwich with the man who could buy any restaurant in the city, Rachel felt clarity wash over her. She watched him wipe mustard from his chin, laughing at his own clumsiness, and saw beyond both the homeless man and the CEO. She saw just Edward. "I've been a fool," she smiled through tears, "because I've been sitting here missing you when you're still the same person I fell in love with." Their second wedding was held in the city park where they used to share their sandwiches. Despite Edward's wealth, they kept it simple and meaningful. Daisies decorated every surface, and guests sat on picnic blankets instead of fancy chairs. Rachel wore a simple white dress, carrying a bouquet of daisies. Edward waited for her under a tree where he used to spend his days as a homeless man. From the back of the gathering, David watched, alone. Sarah had left him weeks ago for a rising tech entrepreneur. His attempt to win back his job at Hamilton Corp had failed miserably. He watched as Rachel and Edward sealed their vows with a kiss, the crowd cheering as daisies were tossed instead of rice. And that's the end of today's story. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more captivating stories. Until next time, keep your imagination alive, and I'll see you in the next story.